The last of our lunch talks or conversations on Meseplas. As you know, this conversation is part of our Basel conversation. We have been listening, attending to incredible talks between the auditorium hall one and this structure in Basilea. It is a pleasure for me to welcome to our little world, to dear friends and colleagues, to accompany Isabel Lewis in what I hope is an exploration of her practice, but also to bring some of the ideas that she had put in place throughout her incredible, insightful, extremely inspiring trajectory. So here with us to talk around those issues under the umbrella of this Techne, Techno, Tech, which I hope Andrea Lisione, moderator, and Claire Tascons, Catherine Wood, and Isabel Lewis will unpack for us. Andrea is Senior Curator International Art Films at Tate Modern, and together, like Catherine Wood, who is Senior Curator International Art Performance at Tate Modern, where former colleague of mine, so I'm very excited that you guys are here. This is a table of all friends, you included. And the last but not least of these friends is Claire Tancons, who is curator, writer, researcher, and congratulations on being one of the curators of the Sarja Biennial, Sarja 14. So without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Andrea, who has come from Sonar in Barcelona, so I'm very grateful to him to come here and join us. This has been an extreme, an exercise that has put under the test our energies, our passion, our bodies. So I'm glad that you are joining me in such a stage. So thank you so much all for coming. And without further ado, I ask you to join me in welcoming this panel. Thank you.
So thank you, Elvira. Thank you also for spoiling the fact that I didn't sleep the last night, and I had the luxury of making what I love, which is research on field and in a place where things happen. And this is actually what I guess you experienced in the last days, witnessing this project, this work that Isabel has been performing in different ways. As Catherine, I guess, we only had the opportunity to see a component, a 50-minute slot of the whole slow walk. So the obvious question is perhaps asking Isabel what the work was about, and perhaps also the very basic information that I always would like to know is how do you react to a proposal? I mean, you get to a place, you spend some time, how do you make something happening like this slow walk that we could see?
Thank you. Nice that all of you are here with me, and thanks for that, and all of you in the public as well that maybe have been seeing these activations of the space. Maybe I'll start with where it all began, with Elvira inviting me to consider taking on this space, the Meseplatz, and the idea of creating a public choreography. For me, when I had to ask myself, with public space and these questions, like what do we mean when we refer to public space, and who is the public that we refer to when we think about public space? And it seemed crucial to me to try to conceive of a project that was not about a performance for the week of Art Basel, but rather a process, a slow process of unfolding that could kind of embed itself in this location over time. So my way of approaching that was to consider creating a series of public workshops. And I began these visits to Basel actually in early May. And I began also by actually doing workshops, talks, lectures, and DJ sets all around the city. meeting different people, meeting different players in the scene, in independent spaces, more central spaces, and then sort of started conceiving of the content of the workshops, which I started to begin to call urban flourishing. The idea of trying to move beyond just urban survival and actually trying to flourish in such an environment. Like for me, I think I'm interested in finding bodily practices that kind of open up liberatory potential in our kind of very highly regulated, highly bureaucratic lives. And I think by engaging with embodiment, this is something that opens a potential for sensibility shift, which I think is desperately needed in Western contemporary culture. And then in this process, I met and found many amazing collaborators. The one I'm working most closely with, is Colin Hacklander, who you heard playing from up high in the parking lot at the end of the slow walk. Who is a composer and a percussionist from Berlin. And there he is, the man himself, Colin Hacklander. Woo! So along with Colin, in a series of lots of conversations about listening and expanded listening, and actually trying to think about listening in an expanded sense, not just with the hearing, but also activating the hearing in a much more active sense of hearing and listening, but applying that to the entire human sensorium, the idea of an entire bodily attunement to urban space and to like dimensionality. I think that's what working with Colin has really brought to me in this project. And along with Colin, there was Arvo Losinger, a parkour practitioner from living in Zurich, working here in Basel and all over Europe. And another one, Nuno Damaso, a Tai Chi and Taekwondo instructor, who was leading our morning Tai Chi sessions. So sort of with this team of different kinds of practitioners, we spoke a lot and worked a lot and exchanged a lot about which kinds of bodily practices could we engage in this particular space that might open up our awareness to that in a new way. And the result of this whole process is this day-long program. That's why I was handing these out, because it's not that 1 hour is the piece or that 1 hour is the performance. It's rather, for me, a process that began, the work started in early May, 3 weeks ago, and continues through the end of today, and maybe beyond that, I don't know. Certainly inside of myself, I'm totally a changed person.
Well, thank you. I think you were incredibly generous, and still there are some components that you didn't necessarily share. For instance, the fact that you are talking, and this can be definitely considered part of your way of working, or you are DJing and sharing music, and therefore activating also a different level of, I wouldn't say necessarily understanding, I would just say performing, or as you were saying, embodying. Everything you described so beautifully has to do with a broader tradition. From flourishing, I will immediately connect to gardening and to something you're very familiar with, and you'll be using and working on listening to sound. So the obvious question for someone like Catherine will be, how do you frame such a practice? I mean, in which kind of tradition, in which kind of history you think what Isabel does can be, yes. Framed is never the good word, because framed we don't like, actually. So maybe, yes.
Frames.
Inhabit. Where does she? What kind of word she does inhabit, or potentially she could inhabit within a tradition?
Elvira labelled both of our job titles, film and performance, so we're framed already. So I'm going to do the geeky museum, performance history bit maybe. But I'm interested in turning up today and seeing that you had already eluded the frame and stepped out of this stage architecture into the street in a way that was borderline invisible, although at the same time I was really moved to see how effective slowing down was actually in that space. But thinking, as Andrea says, thinking about how in your work, since the earliest piece of yours that I saw in Manchester some years ago, where you had a small gathering of us talking about amateur gardening and trying to dance in an industrial space during Manchester Festival, how you make this work that is sensual and uses sound and vibration, perfume, taste. You're often using food. You're often bringing vegetation and plants into the inside space or staging the work outside. And it feels to me, your work seems to me to really resonate with the young generation of artists, like many of them who I see coming up in London now, who are not thinking about cross-disciplinarity in the way that the legacy of the 60s and 70s set it out. So not the kind of theatre of mixed means, which means that different people come from different disciplines and find this collaborative medium, the Black Mountain College model, and neither the 2000s crossing of like the dance into the museum, where the white cube ritual is being explored critically in a very conscious way either. It feels to me like your work comes from actually a kind of refusal of aligning yourself with one or other of those spaces, dance or art or music. And I was kind of wanting to ask you if that's true. Is it post-disciplinary, or is it even learning from, kind of borrowing, decolonial theory? Is it actually de-disciplinary in some way?
Thanks, Catherine. That's a very interesting question. I feel like I sound muted. Sorry, I'm so used to hearing my voice now on the Messeplatz that when it sounds different, it's disorienting. I think it's very, very compelling, like what you're bringing up about these categories. I think there's truly is some very deep-seated resistance, I think, in me to clearly identify in any, not only in these genres, but also even in life, even in relation to my own personal identity, let's say. But I think, like, when I try to deconstruct where that's coming from, yeah, maybe there's some deep-seated psychological aspect to that, but there's as well, for me, I reject the modernist individual, the figure of the modernist individual, with its body separated from its mind, with its distinct categories of feeling and thinking and doing, all of this kind of limitations of these categorizations and these this kind of Frankenstein figure of the modern individual. I think this is actually what I'm actually railing against. It's like, let's unify the human sensorium. And in doing so, for myself, it's hard for me anymore to actually even find, like, I cannot contour out the distinctions of where music, like especially in this project, where sound is completely choreographic and spatialized with what Colin has been bringing to the square. And same, like where my dance, my information, my formation as a dancer moves into my creation of sound and music, I just cannot find anymore the hard edges in between any of these things.
We already reached a very deep level of understanding and, again, framing or trying to situate or locate your practice. I will ask something completely different, but in a similar, let's say, direction to Claire, which is the obvious question. You are an expert in not only, but mostly in parades, in form of collective bodies, I would say, performative involved collective bodies. And how do you watch such a work? What is your way of engaging critically with a work that has no beginning, no end, and no space, but happens everywhere? So how do you really make your mind and your body working to understanding and translating and perhaps becoming a producer at some stage?
Thank you, Andrea, for your question, which I will try to translate into a question back to Isabel. In much the same way that Catherine is asking whether Isabel's work might be post or de-disciplinary, one may be wondering the different modalities through which the work is actually embodied, but along the lines of forms of disembodiment, paradoxically so. The closer one thrives to embodiment at times, and the more actually one may feel disembodied, which might come closer then to answer Andrea's question about how to approach a work that is so open and so diffuse so as to be barely tangible, and certainly more so in the realm of the immaterial, that most forms of performance, to speak of frame, maybe this is actually the first time we're even using the category of performance, which no longer really applies to Isabel's work, and which you may have never actually wanted to conceive your work around or through. But more so, Andrea, than processional performance or parades, what I find interesting to bring into the Messeplatz, and also as a means to contextualize where we find ourselves, is Carnival. In the city of Basel, not only Carnival, but also the marketplace, particularly in the city of Basel, where both these traditions continue to be very pregnant. And the reason why I'm bringing Carnival to the fore is not so much because it is a topic with which I have been engaged for many years, but really because I think that strange and even suspect, though hosting such occasions on the Messeplatz may have been, suspect for being in the middle of a commercial art fair, if one looks back at all the forms of human gatherings that are both structuring and structural to the self and the human, then one understands how such cyclical, reoccurring events as Carnival, or as the Biennial, or as the fair, are actually in keeping with the kinds of activities that Isabel has been doing, if only beyond recognition because of then what she brings into the contemporary. So I just wanted to, as a means to, again, contextualizing where we are on the Messeplatz in the city of Basel, to think of this longer cycle of rituals and festivals within which the Biennial and the art fair calendar is in a way embedded and a contemporary manifestation of. And then, of course, I mean, you know, I don't know that Carnival is post or de-disciplinary, but certainly it is a field of diffuse bodies and sensibilities that escapes any one such categorization. So there again, if not Carnival, but certainly a sense of the carnivalesque, conceptualized and as it may be, I think is pertinent for understanding Isabel's work here on the Messeplatz in Basel in particular. But now, if I may ask you a question, Isabel, and to move into the matter of embodiment or disembodiment, I have been wondering how you have been thinking about the matter of enfleshment instead. In as much as following Spieler, before there is the body, there is the flesh. And the reason why the flesh might interest us here is in relationship to your particular incorporated bodily sensibility as a woman of color here in the center of the Messeplatz, watching you as I have, doing everything from leading these slow walks to leading, along with Colin, these electronic music disturbance workshops, to, I mean, giving philosophy classes, sitting on the ground with the bodily ease that you so uniquely are able to bring. I was mesmerized, and I was mesmerized because of your particular embodied subjectivity. And so I am wondering how you conceive of practices of embodiment in terms of cultural specificity, maybe, and in terms of, this, I mean, contextually, if you will, because we've been speaking in very abstract terms, but I'm wondering, again, about how you think this through.
Great. Thank you. Very, very good and rich questions with many parts. And let's see if I can try to bring it in and make it more concrete. I mean, I think as for my formation, I think, my dance training and having begun my whole interest in art by studying ballet and very strictly for many years. So I have a long history, let's say, of working with the body. And not only that, there's also the cultural specificity of my household, growing up in a family with an American Jewish father, a mother from the Dominican Republic, and music, dance was something that was always part of the fabric of the household, absolutely. An interest, I suppose, somewhere around the time of my teenage years, there comes a point where ballet, where I become aware of ballet as not only, as a very particular expression of a particular value system from a particular time and era. So this kind of, 17th century French approach to the body and to the idea of controlling nature, controlling the body. And I somehow become aware to that to the degree where it no longer feels possible for me to engage in that practice, feeling in many ways that it was too limited, rigid, structured. It didn't also address me or my cultural specificity. And then begins a very long process, which continues until today, of trying to bring as many different kinds of codes to the body, because I was marked by that ballet. All of those years of ballet, a decade worth of ballet, cannot be erased from my body. It's structured my brain, it has structured my body. But I realized I would not be able to get rid of it, but I could encode, in a way, as many other possible types of embodiment in order to sort of be able to somehow then decide for myself which value systems I wanted to engage in and when. And oftentimes also then leading to mixing up these forms, which I think is where a lot of my choreographic impulse comes from, is sort of mixing and becoming aware of a value system on a bodily level, not just on an intellectual level, and exploring that. So whether it's at the club, or whether that's researching dances from the 60s, whether that's looking at African dances in particular places, and then how those transform when they are transferred then to Europe. And all of these things are traceable through dances. I think that you can really read dances as these cultural storage systems. And I think this has kept me fascinated my entire life, and I have a feeling will continue to keep me engaged in that way. And so all of this is, of course, practice. This means that I've been engaged in bodily practice in one form or another for a very, very long time. And I think I always also felt the necessity to, in the way that I became I kind of was able to sort of become aware of what the value system inside of classical ballet was. Similarly, I had that same feeling when I was studying in university literary criticism and philosophy, and I could feel that this is a particular technique of intellectuality from a particular tradition, and I could feel in my body the value systems it proposed. And at that point, it became extremely clear to me that I could not leave behind my dancing, because at one point I thought I would just continue in this academic route, actually. But I could not actually let go, that they needed each other, that what was missing, I was looking for something that I didn't see in the university, that I didn't see in the culture I was growing up in, that I didn't see anywhere. So I felt, okay, I have to somehow generate this. I have to be the bridge between intellectual forms of thought and bodily modes of thought, and try as hard as possible to even diminish those distinctions. And I think I'm still very much in that process. I can't say that I've eliminated the idea of like the mind and the body fully. I still, nonetheless, by saying those terms, they're still clearly present. But I as this bridge maker, this is sort of what I wish for my work to do and how I feel and experience myself. Maybe that gets to part of it. Okay.
Well, thank you, Isabel. It was very, again, generous. And I think provided us to understand more of something that looks like a very basic and simple action but has layers and layers of thought behind. But actually we say so much is about experiencing and about seeing and working perhaps and being part or deciding of not to be in part. But still there is another layer which is sound. And given Colin it's here, if you don't mind, I was just curious to ask you, how did you work on the sound and how did you come up with this and how would you describe it? I mean, what did we listen to and what did we hear? Because it's so present actually.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so my involvement in the project has been very much in the spirit of cultivating a kind of heightened perceptual state. So as my area is sound, I'm a musician and composer, so we've been doing a lot of very close listening to the sounds on the plots, the sounds that are here already, the sounds that are always present. Even right now I'm kind of hypnotized by the sound of this fountain behind. But so in the workshop I developed, we've been approaching sound from various perspectives with two ideas in mind of activating the mesoplots sonically. One is through physically producing sound, and the other is activation through awareness. So we've been listening attentively, listening actively. And yeah, this is quite interesting. So for example, thinking about reverberation in the space, delay, echo, the way that every sound kind of translates into one another, into all the other sounds in the plots. And for example, this is what the drummers are doing when they're spread out at the beginning of the night with the drum groups. They're spread out throughout the space. They're giving very unique sonic impressions of the architecture. And we're listening for depth, for localization. You know, we're often closing the eyes, and like this, I think we can access the potential power of this latent sense that has been kind of pushed aside by a predominantly visual culture. So it's fascinating. The results, I think, are fascinating.
And yeah, thank you. That again is another layer, and perhaps this can link to what kind of suggestion, Isabel, you gave him. But on a completely different hand, why did you go for the title of this talk? Why did you decide to call this talk in that specific way, which has to do with, on the one hand, technology, the other one also a very specific kind of sound?
Yes, so the talk Techno, Techne, Tech, I was wanting to create a title, of course, that had its own kind of sonic character, that in your mind it would kind of make this beat, it would make a song if you would sing it, or a kind of tune. And I think it also helps to maybe focus in on the things that of my current, long-term interest, right? But I think it's taken a certain amount of time and courage, I suppose, that needed to be built to be able to believe that maybe actually engaging in practice in public space could generate a vibe, could generate a kind of qualitative, energetic quality that could be compelling. So this idea of absorption, when a person is absorbed in a practice, whether it's the drummers listening to Colin's click tracks at the end of the day, and then when they play together, they're absorbed in this practice, in this deep relation that they have with the drum. And I think this is what practice brings. So practice brings these very intimate relations, whether it's with an instrument, whether it's with your own body, whether it's with a particular tradition or technique. So this idea that for me, that this has become, at this stage in my life, I guess, having performed in such a range of possible iterations of performance, so many possible iterations of dance with multiple directors, and like really over several years. Even in my own choreographic work is much more interested now in what is the choreography of that inner experience that could hopefully, maybe, possibly generate enough of a kind of inner absorption, intensity, engagement, that in this quality, that maybe that quality could be compelling. Because I think we, as Donna Haraway has written in the 80s, and here we are all these years later, like we truly are cyborgs, and we are integrated with technology in every single way. And furthermore, another Donna Haraway quote that Donna Haraway says that we've actively determined our design, our human design, through our relations with technology, with tools, that technology is a tool that always refers back to the body, and this tool is a way that the human mediates its relation to the world. So since tool use, we've been determining our design. So I don't like this notion of essentializing the body back to some very abstract, romanticized idea of natural. It doesn't exist. And techno, yes, I think like electronic music, my journey, my learning about electronic music in the 8 years that I've lived in Berlin has massively informed the ways I think about composition, the way I think about building dramaturgical flows through a duration. These are things that I learned from club life, from dancing to DJs, from making music myself. So that's it.
So practice and then skills, philosophy, theory, a very crucial background for you, and last but not least also music and way of composing and reading a specific environment like the dance floor. And as a curator, Catherine, how do you've been working with Isabel, right, in a very important way, how do you bring such a practice within a museum, which is a coded space that we all imagine me the ideal space for wandering, but then it's very much coded. So how do you approach such a practice?
It was wonderful working with Isabel, because especially the way that her work acknowledged and changed the human infrastructure in the museum and the way we rely on doing things, actually. I mean, aside from the beautiful, beautiful installation you made in the tank spaces at Tate Modern with air plants hanging in the east tank, and an environment in the architecture of the lobby amongst the columns with plants and perfume, I think one of the things that really struck me was how you immediately began to work on the choreographies already going on, and not just the very intense visitor flow, but also the way that at 5:45 our security guards would come in. This is a very specific detail, but so telling, actually. The security guards would come in and start, sort of turn the lights on and shout quite loudly to people, the museum's closing, and abruptly try to kind of usher people out. And Isabel began to work on this kind of sensuous alternative approach to shifting people's mass movement in the museum by getting the dancers that she was working with to begin to move in the direction and kind of seduce people out, which was amazing. But I think maybe the key overriding thing that I learned from working with Isabel was her approach to hosting. And I feel her thinking around the role of being an artist as a host is fascinating, and the kind of invisible aspect of what we're all trying to do running museums. And we sort of pretend we're not doing. We pretend we're this neutral, authoritative state structure that is welcoming the public as a homogeneous mass. And Isabel thought about it in this very nuanced way that I read as being a feminist way. Interestingly, I think in terms of what you've just said, I think you kind of displaced yourself as performer by doing it, even though you were authoritative in the way you speak. It wasn't about you performing for a public, it was about you opening a space in which we would observe and be part of many other things happening. So your role as host was creating something from another tradition than the tradition the museum thinks it's in, and also displacing your centrality as an artist in a funny way, in visual terms. Well, in an important way.
Well, maybe we can move again to Claire and ask rather from the museum to the exhibition, you're working often on exhibition, and you're also conceiving exhibition that need to, I guess, have a beginning, an end, a message to share. How do you situate within an exhibition a work of as the work of Isabel? How do you see it? Would you imagine a series of different performative events, one next to the other, therefore working on a timeline? Or, I mean, how do we engage with this question of time and the format that we still call the exhibition, or is it rather a festival? Maybe it's interesting for us to know that.
I think, Andrea, you're formulating a question that Catherine and you yourself at Tate are very much working through, and that I am learning from, specifically in terms of the time-based exhibition / festival within which Isabel took part, which was, how was it called, Catherine? 4 days? I'm sorry, 10 days, 6 nights. I was not fortunate to see it, but I was watching or tuning in as intently as I could. And the reason why I'm bringing this is because I think that we find ourselves around Isabel looking for ways to inflect our exhibitionary practices beyond this frame that we've all been schooled in. And that Isabel, as much as you continue to use a language of refusal, I understand your practice as being very much affirmative and assertive and building of another space. Paradoxically, the term that Foucault used to refer to museums and other such spaces. And that is what I'm interested in, and that is what I think we have difficulties getting our head around, because the references against which you may abut are diffused enough so as to create a space, like literally a third space, and to think again in feminist or race terms, that escapes our comprehension of what space and time can be within an exhibitionary context. I don't know if this is something for you to speak back to, as someone who, for all of what we say though, is being invited by visual arts and performance curators within such forum as a museum, be it as amazingly open as the Tate Modern with the tanks and the Turban Hall, or even here within the framework of the fair. And actually, Isabel, this is something that I meant to ask you. Could you conceive of your practice existing outside of these tropes of the exhibitionary and of the curatorial, within which you have thus far found yourself embedded in, for the better, for what we can see? But I'm curious to know.
Thank you. You brought up a lot of great things. I think I can absolutely imagine the work existing outside of these tropes. I think it also does. There's a way in which, yes, I'm very much embedded in this, and for good reasons, because all of my, let's say that I'm still operating on the level of composition. That's what's led me here. It's about thinking through performance history past and art history past, thinking through all of these developments in art and contemporary art history, and for whatever reason always feeling compelled to ask what's beyond the standardized understanding of this. What kind of potential could be beyond composing in a linear timeline? I think I slammed my head against the wall with that question for about 10 years. How do I get out of the trap of composing in a sequence? How can I think about composition as a spatialized possibility with perhaps clouds of content, as I tend to think of it, that can be rearranged according to the live situation? How can I make a work which is responsive, which can breathe and be truly alive and respond to the given situation? So these are questions of composition which could be considered inside of a classical tradition, I suppose, of aesthetics or of art or contemporary understandings of art. Simultaneously, I'm very much interested in the integration of life and art, our understanding of art or perhaps it wasn't even designated as such, art as such as a kind of modernist category, but art as integrated. So I think when I hear words like invisibility, I get excited because there's agency in that. There's I think integration and embeddedness is the thing that I've been seeking in all of what I do. So, for example, in like what is the existing choreography of any particular place? It's the same question that I had to ask myself. What is the choreography that exists within my body before other training, which is the training that I inherit? This is like habitus, which has led to like also big research on my part on sociological, cultural analysis of the body and how we learn, we are habituated into a specific cultural choreography, and that's the starting place. And so I think if you don't see big, expressive, representative kinds of movements or dances from me, they are dances nonetheless that operate first from our, let's say, each individual's core choreography, their habitus, their cultural imprint of how we move, sit, eat, and all of the habits of every day. And I guess I'm always searching for, this is going back a little bit to Andrea, you had a question, how I approach a situation. So I'm thinking of the Tate, I'm thinking of here, it's always, what's already there? What's existing? And there's a lot. Like, it's not a neutral space. And I think, and I never thought of it as such. I think my experience in the theater was as well that it was highly strange that we would consider the black box or the proscenium as a kind of neutral zone where you would take your work that you've been working on in the dance studio and kind of transplant it into the space as though nothing had happened. And that was shocking to me. It's like, this is a completely coded space. And any space is coded, right? And so I think that is first and foremost also on my mind when I approach a place like here. Like, what are the movements here? And everything that I then choose to unfold is a kind of is truly in relation and in response to what's already existing, what I somehow feel is appropriate, what can kind of integrate into the habit of a place and nonetheless like twist it.
Well, again, thank you. We understand that your way of working is very much based on deep listening, to some extent, on becoming an antenna, on perceiving, on experiencing, and transforming what you gather from an environment more than a place or a group of people. And I particularly like this image of clouds that are shapeless and are literally finding their place at whatever height in a space. Still, your work wouldn't be completely done without involving the audience, or the public better than the audience, surrounding us. So perhaps this is the best moment for us to open up. Some of you were involved in performing, some of you were involved in unconsciously performing and being part of a temporary stage, so it's the best moment for asking questions to Isabel.
Yeah, it's more like a comment. I was joining in for the morning session mostly and some of the urban flourishing. And as a mindfulness practitioner and also teacher, I found it extremely helpful to connect to a space like this. And because while you were talking previously that if we practice whatever we practice, we also sometimes are in a bubble. Even if we practice connection, then sometimes still it's not like this sociability you are talking about. And I mean, I'm really completely satisfied with this 5 days or more, weeks. And I wonder now if this couldn't be a ritual, like setting up something in Basel, you know, or in any city, as another practice, a sociability practice. So I don't know if you have any ideas about that.
Yeah, I live in Berlin, so that makes it somewhat challenging. But I think that if there's interest, and I don't see why not. Like, I think that what I proposed here in Basel was a long engagement in a series of practices, and now there is what has formed what people call immaterial, which is why I kind of never agree with calling this live work that we do immaterial, because it's so physical. It is so material, in fact. These bonds are very real, and these bonds have been established here. So I think we can see if these bonds if the bonds are strong enough, and there's a wish to continue in some way or form. I can absolutely imagine facilitating that, even if I can't be here all the time.
This is a wonderful question that we are discussing about so often, which is how do we collect these practices? How do we engage throughout time? How do we give life to something that is full of life and deserves to be performed, and likely also kept alive as much as possible within a museum frame or within the public space, so that can be somehow run or managed by a museum? That would be an ideal scenario. Yes? Thank you.
Thank you, first of all. It's fascinating. I think it's incredibly, it's wonderful and incredibly important what you're doing with your work. You talked a lot about the relationship between like craftsmanship and the input of what's happening in the space, the sounds, the people. With this space, particularly Mesoplatz, it changed a lot throughout the course of the week. The people here, the amount, everything changed very quickly to how it was last weekend. You had a program, so I was kind of interested to know how much in terms of the programming, and then how much in terms of improvisation, and how, if there were particular points in the week where you made changes. Also, when Catherine talked about the Tate and the security guards, whether that was something that happened once you were there, or whether it was something that was noticed and planned in advance.
Yeah, I think these are all of these details come along inside of a very organic process, I would say. Definitely at this point, after as Claire mentioned, this creation of a third space, thank you for bringing that, because I think that's so true. I do tend to rather think of creating rather than only deconstructing, and I think this third space, which what I call what I've created as the occasion, what I call the occasion as a practice, it's not only like a format for experiencing something, it's also a practice for me, and I feel that I've started to approach and think about composition in different ways, so that of course in any new place, yes, I try to scan and take a look and observe all that's already going on, and I try to respond to it accordingly, to try to sort of achieve, let's say, a certain the quality of attention and the quality, the softness. There's a certain softness that I'm after, and a way of somehow slipping into the scene without imposing myself onto a situation. So that is a back and forth process, and I suppose what I've learned with the occasions is how to create structures, how to compose structures which have enough flexibility within them to be able to respond to the changing nature of reality, really, of life, of every day here on the Mesoplatz, for example. So it's both. It takes a lot of composition and structure in order to be able to leave also space for things to emerge, and they have all week. New things have been emerging. Every day is different. Even with the program, gives a sort of hourly rhythm throughout the day. But each talk, I speak freely at the beginning of each hour, and each talk is slightly different. The people at that time of day, on that time of day and on that particular day are different. The energies are different. The weather is different. So it's truly a lot what I've also learned from gardens, what I've learned from studying gardens as a mode of composition, which is exactly that, proposes something rather concrete, but is nonetheless totally porous and contingent, and the experience of the garden can change entirely depending on the weather, whether a cloud passes over the sun, the time of year. So I think I've really framed my way of thinking about composition based on like all of my research on gardening, really, as a kind of format for a composition that can be contingent and porous and nonetheless precise.
there any other question? If not, perhaps we should definitely say that this wonderful gathering can continue in a very smooth way, like tuning to reality. I will actually now leave to my dear friend Elvira.
Well, just want to say thank you so much to everyone for your contributions. But also, we will have a little bit of time to speak with Claire Tancons about her practice, but also about other artists and other forms of collective practices around the world. And I found extremely interesting to have the chance to also immerse your practice within the context of the global context, let's say, no? Because you also, Claire, bring that to the table. So join us now from 2 to 3 for this activation. Join us at 3 back here and continue to enjoy Basilea. I have to say, this is the last of our talks. It's been incredible having Lara Almarsegui, joined by Anna Minton, I'm going to remind it, Emily Scott and Manuel Herth, but also Recetas Urbanas, Santi Cirujeda, joined by Baharak Tahbash, and David Juarez and Patti Anajoroy, discussing around issues on self-construction and self-governance. As part of what we have as Creative Time, try to engage with and call into consideration and creating awareness of our role as citizens, of our role as part of a larger community here and elsewhere. So thank you so much for coming, and see you in everything else.
So I'm going to just go ahead and continue. Turn me up.